So far, we've been exploring the particular circumstances that gave rise to the creation of the Knights Templar, including the significance of the city of Jerusalem to the three Abrahamic faiths, the request from the Byzantine emperor to Christians in the West for help fighting back against Turkish forces that were attacking his lands, the desire of the Pope to use this opportunity to try and forge a reconnection between Eastern and Western Christendom, and perhaps to even reunify the two halves of the Roman Empire, and the combination of population growth and increase in religious fervor that perhaps encouraged many, including younger sons, to seek opportunities in the East. I said earlier that a Templar was an utterly new kind of knight, and that he was also a monk. Or you might say that a Templar was a new kind of monk, and that he was also expected to be a knight. Medieval society in Western Europe at this time was structured according to the three estates model. Specifically, the world was divided into those who fight, the nobility, those who pray, the clergy, monks, priests, etc., and those who work, the peasants, or essentially everyone else. The idea was that people were supposed to stay in their lane, leaving fighting to the nobles, praying to the religious figures, and producing food to the workers. If you were a warrior, you were supposed to take up arms and protect the rest of society, particularly members of the clergy. This was because they were expressly forbidden to take up arms and fight. That was not their job. Their job was to pray and thus help guide all of humanity towards salvation. If you were a farmer or a craftsman, you were not supposed to fight, and you would not be expected to spend excessive time in prayer, as that would detract from your ability to provide food and goods for knights and monks. But with the calling of the Crusades, medieval society found itself in rather uncharted waters, as this utterly new endeavor created situations for which it was not prepared. Jonathan Riley Smith, one of the greatest scholars of the Crusades, famously described the crusading forces that set out from the West in 1098 as a, quote, military monastery on the move. And that description alone indicates how novel and different the situation was. Apart from the fact that things military and things monastic should have nothing to do with each other, according to the ideal of the three estates social model, there's also the fact that anything monastic should not be moving anywhere. When men and women entered a monastery or a convent, they had to take specific vows of chastity, obedience, poverty, and stability of place, meaning that they were to stay firmly rooted in the religious house and should not go traveling about the medieval world. But as I've explained before, the formation of the Crusader states, as they came to be called, created a greater enthusiasm among Western Europeans for pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Among those pilgrims were a sizable number who traveled to Jerusalem in the hope of obtaining a cure for an illness. Also, people who knew they were nearing the end of their lives might travel to the Levant with the express intention of dying either on crusade or after having arrived there, as such a pilgrimage would provide substantial remission of sin and thus would theoretically lessen the time spent in purgatory after death and speed them on their way to heaven. And then, of course, there were plenty of people who might have started out perfectly healthy, but became ill after the long, strenuous journey to the East. It was this sudden influx of sick, injured, and dying pilgrims to Jerusalem that prompted the formation of the Knights Hospitaller in 1113. Their creation was made official by a papal bull in that year, and they were under the direct supervision of Pope Paschal II. Now, the Hospitallers were specifically formed as a monastic and charitable order, and their sole purpose was to aid the ill and the injured. And this is exactly what they did under their first leader, the Blessed Gerard of Martigues. Around 1118, Gerard was succeeded by Raymond Dupuy, who both expanded the order's medical services and did something new. he began to create a small detachment from within the order that would serve as armed escorts for pilgrims who were at risk of attack. But it's important to emphasize here that the primary charge of the Hospitallers was to care for sick and injured pilgrims. They created this side venture in order to make sure that they could perform their main mission successfully. It seems likely that the fact that the Hospitallers, a religious order modeled after other monastic orders, had branched out into protection is perhaps part of the reason that the Templars were able to come into existence at all. Because while Hospitallers started focusing on security and protection as a sideline to their main endeavor, the Templars had security and protection as their primary charge. But back to 1118. In or around the same year, a man named Hugues de Pin, who had come to the Holy Land on crusade as part of the retinue of his lord, Count Hugues de Champagne, also recognized the need for a protection service for pilgrims who were traveling to and throughout the Crusader kingdoms. For while strongholds at Edessa, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli provided safe havens for Christians in the Levant, getting between those locations safely was another matter altogether. Hugues de Pin, along with one of his comrades, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, decided to stay in the Holy Land rather than return to France with Hugues de Champagne, initially out of a desire, it seems, to live a traditional monastic life. But soon after, events occurred that underscored the desperate need for armed protection for Christians in the Holy Land, and probably shifted Hugues and Godfrey's ambition away from a religious life of contemplation and prayer and toward a more active career. First, on Easter 1119, a group of 700 or so pilgrims set out to walk from Jerusalem to the Jordan River, a distance of about 80-some miles. Given the size of the group, they probably assumed there would be safety in numbers. They were very, very wrong. They were near the River Jordan when they were set upon by non-Christian raiders who were based in the city of Ascalon. At least 300 of the pilgrims were slaughtered, and 60 were taken as captives and sold into slavery. Then, in June of 1119, the Crusader Principality of Antioch came under attack by the forces of the Muslim leader Ilghazi of Mardin. The leader of the Crusader army at Antioch, Roger of Salerno, ignored advice to send to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem for reinforcements, and instead decided to take on Ilghazi's forces, which were estimated to be some 20,000 strong, with just 700 knights, 500 Armenian cavalry, 3,000 or so infantry, and maybe an additional 2,000 fighters. Roger's forces were utterly annihilated, and by some accounts, only 2 men of the whole Crusader army survived the day. The battle came to be known as the Battle of the Field of Blood, and it marked a moment when Western European forces began to fully realize how challenging it was going to be to hang on to the Crusader states. So Hugues and Godfrey, and probably a few other men who were also eager to provide protection for pilgrims in the area, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and offered their services. The king eagerly accepted, and what's more, he gave the Templars as their headquarters part of the royal enclosure on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was believed to have been part of the original palace of King Solomon. Now, this headquarters was in fact not the Temple of King Solomon, but rather the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but none of the Western Christians knew that. When they entered the structure, they tried to figure out what it was, and Temple of Solomon was their best guess. So Baldwin essentially granted them a charter of confraternity, and in keeping with their desire to live a religious life, they were placed under the authority of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest-ranking church authority in the Levant. According to tradition, 9 brothers took vows before the Patriarch in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Christmas Day in 1119. At this time, they were designated the Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templicae Salomonici, or the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It is only much later that they began to be called Templars due to their headquarters on the Temple Mount. Hugues de Pin was named the first Grand Master of the order, and he would occupy a role somewhere between the abbot of a monastery and a military commander. And although they would eventually become known for their significant wealth, money management, and indeed significant loans made to some royal houses of Europe, for the first decade the Templars were indeed very poor. In fact, the Great Seal of the Grand Master of the Temple famously shows two knights riding together on a single horse because in the early years of the order, they were so poor, they had to share everything. We don't have many details about these early years, but it's safe to assume that they did the best they could at the job for which they had volunteered, to provide protection to Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They must have done a decent job, or at the least made a sincere and dedicated effort, because sometime in 1126 or 1127, King Baldwin II sent Hugues back to France on a two-pronged mission. Part one of the mission was to help solve a succession crisis. Baldwin had only daughters, and other Crusader leaders were understandably anxious about what would happen upon Baldwin's death. The proposed solution was to marry his eldest daughter, Melisande, to Count Fulk V of Anjou, a well-respected French nobleman with ties to other royal European houses. His son Godfrey IV of Anjou married Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England and heir to the English throne. Fulk had also already demonstrated an interest in and commitment to crusading, having traveled to the Holy Land in 1120. The second part of Hugues' mission was to drum up support for the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, both in terms of attempting to recruit new members to the order and in terms of raising money. To keep and maintain horses, armor, and weapons, all necessary if the Templars were going to do the important work of protecting pilgrims, they needed money and they needed manpower. They needed stable hands to care for the horses, and they needed servants who could handle the day-to-day running of the headquarters, procuring and preparing food, purchasing and mending clothing, and taking care of other household tasks that would need doing, while the poor brothers were busy patrolling the highways and byways around Jerusalem and the other Crusader states. It is a measure of the esteem in which King Baldwin held the Templars, and in particular Hugues, that he entrusted him with this special mission. What's more, Baldwin seemed to recognize that if the Templars were going to be successful in their endeavor in the Holy Land, they needed more than the support of himself and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. They needed the Pope himself to come out firmly in support of the order. Now, you'll recall that Hugues de Pin had first journeyed to Jerusalem on crusade with Count Hugues de Champagne, whose vassal he was. The relationship with Count Hugues would prove to be important in this next stage of the development of the order. After spending a few years at home, during which he surely shared stories about his experiences in the Holy Land, including that one of his men had decided to stay there, Count Hugues de Champagne decided in 1125 to go back to Jerusalem and become a Templar himself. This surely made an impression on his subjects. So when Hugues de Pin made his way back to his native Troyes on his recruiting mission, his way had been smoothed and prepared considerably by the Count. But Hugues didn't just go back to his homeland with a stop in Anjou to ask Count Fulk if he was willing to marry Melisande of Jerusalem and take the throne upon Baldwin's death. Between 1127 and 1130, he traveled throughout Western Europe to promote the Templars, seek donations and approval, and encourage others to join him. This journey almost certainly took him to Rome, where he met with Pope Honorius II. We also know he traveled to the regions of Poitou, Normandy, England, Scotland, Flanders, and probably a few other places. It's important to remember that in the 1120s, the crusading movement was considered a success back in Europe. Jerusalem had been brought under Christian control. 3 additional Crusader states had been formed, and by all accounts, lesser-ranking members of the nobility, who might have enjoyed a life of moderate comfort in the European West, found it possible to occupy positions of power, rule, wealth, and prestige in the East. What's more, the fact that these people had gone on crusade in the first place meant that they had achieved significant forgiveness of sins, if not complete remission. So to everyone who had stayed behind in Europe, it seemed like perhaps they had made the wrong choice. This meant that when Hugues went on his promotional tour in the late 1120s, people were eager to help the crusading cause. By making donations to support the cause in general, and in this case, the Templars in particular, they would be doing a good deed to help the church and maybe erase some time from purgatory after death. Hugues de Pin successfully completed both goals of his mission. Folk of Anjou agreed to the marriage to Melisande, and the people donated not just movable wealth to the Templars, but also grants of land. Now, you may be thinking, how is land in France going to help an order in Jerusalem? Well, any profits from the land, either from rents received from tenants who wanted to work the land, or income from the sale of crops grown on the land, or from items the land might help produce, like wool or milk, would go into the Templars' accounts. And because the Templars were a religious order, with its members pledging chastity, obedience, and poverty, once funds came in, they only went out to cover basic expenses of necessity. None of the wealth would pass to anyone as an inheritance. None of the individual brothers would have access to funds that they might squander irresponsibly. Indeed, it is a particular irony that pretty much every medieval religious order starts out professing a desire to live in poverty, but over time, and because of the circumstances I just mentioned, plus the fact that monks spent so much time working hard at their appointed tasks, pretty much every order found itself wealthy in spite of itself. The donations of land are important for another reason. Now that the Templars owned property in Western Europe, they had several bases of operation that would not be subject to any of the security concerns in the Levant. Christian-held cities and fortresses in the Crusader states would be under near constant threat from Muslim forces. Cities and chapter houses and fortresses in France and England would not. In England, King Henry I gave the Templars a significant amount of gold and silver, plus dedicated land for a Templar house in London and in other locales throughout the country. And if you've ever wondered why Temple Bar in London is called that, it's because the bar was one of the original entrances to the city, and right near it used to be the Templar headquarters. The Templars got another boost in wealth and status in 1134, when King Alfonso I of Aragon died without an heir. He left 1/3 of his entire kingdom to the Templars. Now, the will was contested and the Templars didn't get everything, but they did get 6 castles in Aragon to add to the strongholds they held in France and England. And this is important because the Iberian Peninsula, what we today think of as Spain and Portugal, was in fact undergoing a mini crusade of its own, the Reconquista, which had the goal of retaking Al-Andalus, which had been under Muslim control since the mid-8th century. There's one more critical piece to the success of Hugues' grand tour in the late 1120s, and this has to do with one of the most important religious figures of the day, Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk and abbot who was deeply respected and revered throughout the Christian community. Now, Bernard is an absolutely fascinating figure. One historian has referred to him as the, quote, rock star of the medieval world, and based on his voluminous writings and the records of people's responses to him, he seems to have been an extraordinary individual, full of energy and incredibly persuasive and charismatic. When he decided to join the monastic order of the Cistercians, not only did he embrace the strictly ascetic life, but he also somehow persuaded a bunch of friends and relatives, by one count it's over 30, to turn their backs on secular life and in some cases, to turn their backs on lucrative and prestigious positions, wives, and children, and join the Cistercian order with him. Very quickly, Bernard moved up the ranks to abbot and then became head of his own monastery at Clairvaux. And just over 20 years after his death, he was canonized by the church. Apparently, this guy was on the sainthood express. And his writings have remained relevant and important into the modern period. He was declared a doctor of the church in the 19th century. The Catholic Church reserves the title of doctor for those saints who have contributed significantly to the development and clarification of church doctrine and theology. As of this lecture, there are thousands of saints, but only 37 doctors. Bernard is keeping company with the likes of St. Augustine, Pope Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, the Venerable Bede, and Hildegard of Bingen, to name just a few. Now, it appears that King Baldwin of Jerusalem had reached out to Bernard ahead of Hugues' journey west, and he had asked Bernard to offer his support for the Templars. In 1128, Bernard convened a church council in the city of Troyes. There were numerous high-ranking clerics in attendance, including a representative from Pope Honorius II. It was at this council that Bernard made his case for the papacy to give the Order of the Temple official recognition, and thanks in large measure to Bernard's powers of persuasion, this recognition was granted by the council. What they needed next was an official rule, like those that monks living within a monastery would follow, and it was Bernard who wrote this rule for them. The rule itself has 72 clauses and includes details about how the members of the order should dress, how frequently they should eat meat, how often they should pray, and various other instructions that would look familiar to anyone with a passing knowledge of Benedictine or Cistercian monasticism. Around this same time, Bernard also composed a longer document that is perhaps the most important and most famous from this period as regards the justification for this new order. It's titled De Laude Novi Militiae, or In Praise of the New Knighthood, and usually referred to by Templar scholars as the De Laude. It was a letter written by Bernard to Hugues de Pin, supposedly after Hugues had asked Bernard 3 times to please do so. It starts by extolling the virtues of the Templars and takes great pains to acclaim them as the greatest order of the day, better even, Bernard takes care to note, than the Hospitallers. As we'll see in later lectures, the relationship between the Hospitallers and the Templars would be one that was both complex and fraught. Bernard then elaborated on elements in the original rule, discussing what their daily routines should look like, how they should comport themselves in their headquarters on the Temple Mount, what kind of prayers they should say and when, how they should take 2 meals a day in silence while listening to passages from Scripture being read aloud, and other such details. While most of this looked much like other rules in monastic orders, Bernard also was careful to acknowledge that, as this was a brand new kind of order, and it had military as well as monastic duties, the order needed to be able to possess land and money, to demand taxes, etc., to keep itself functioning and to keep doing its job. It also could not be beholden to the usual schedule of monastic prayers, which, at a minimum, usually required monks to stop whatever they were doing and pray at least 5 times a day, and sometimes as many as 9 times a day. The monastic day began with matins, which would happen sometime around 2 to 4 a.m. Monks would rise from their beds, attend prayer, and then go back to sleep for a few more hours of sleep. Next would come lauds in the early morning, followed by prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, and compline, although in some orders the observance of prime through non was combined into 1 or 2 prayer times instead of 4. Now, if you are a Templar in the midst of a protection assignment for pilgrims, you obviously can't just keep stopping along a very dangerous highway to observe the liturgical hours. Recognizing this, Bernard instructed that whenever they could not take the time to observe the daily prayers, simply reciting a certain number of Our Fathers would suffice. Also, in the first part of the treatise addressed to Hugues, Bernard made the case that the new situation Christians found themselves in as regards the Crusader states meant that there must be a new kind of knight who practiced a new knighthood, which would, quote, ceaselessly wage a twofold war both against flesh and blood and against a spiritual army of evil in the heavens. This knighthood was nothing like typical secular worldly knighthood, which Bernard called knavery, and which was concerned with physical adornment, conquest, and material gain. In the new knighthood, the spiritual armor of faith that shielded the soul was just as important, if not more so, than the physical armor that protected the knight's body. Given that the order of the Knights Templar was unlike any knightly or monastic order that had ever existed, there was some serious unease about combining two of the three estates of medieval society, those who fought and those who prayed, into a single entity. While Bernard's treatise managed to allay some of those concerns, novel times call for novel solutions, criticism of the Templars as both monks and knights would continue to occur throughout the order's existence. The second part of Bernard's treatise doesn't get nearly as much attention as the first half, but it is in fact really interesting to consider if we're trying to understand the function of the Templars. In the second half, Bernard provides a list of all the sacred sites in the Holy Land that the Templars may have occasion to visit in the course of their duties. Not only does he list them, but he also offers significant amounts of information about each of them. By doing this, Bernard is identifying the Templars as the particular custodians of these sacred sites and thus emphasizing that the Templars are needed. There is no one else willing or able to provide security at all these locations. And with all the information that Bernard provides about each site, it also becomes clear that in addition to protecting the pilgrims who traveled to these sites, the Templars were also supposed to act kind of like tour guides, explaining to visitors what was so significant or holy or special about particular locales. This was another clever move, because if the Crusader states were going to continue to function, they needed significant financial support. More often than not, that support would come in the form of donations made by pilgrims when they reached the Holy Land. When elderly pilgrims died there, those pilgrims usually willed goods and property to one of the Christian organizations in the Holy Land. The Crusader states also needed the economic boost of a large tourist population. Pilgrims would need to buy food, pay for lodging, and engage locals to provide other services, all of which would pump money into the Crusader states. And thus, they needed Christians to keep on coming from the West, and they needed them to stay for a significant amount of time, visiting various holy sites. And to keep the Christians coming and to keep them staying, they needed it to be as safe and easy as possible. The Templars were the solution to the problem. And after the Council of Troyes, their rise in status, increase in wealth, and success in recruiting new members meant that they were poised to become one of the most powerful organizations in the Holy Land. Join me for our next lecture, when we will discuss some of the key moments in the next 50 years of the Templars' existence, many of which propelled them to greater and greater heights, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for the calamitous fall that would happen almost 2 centuries later.